Well, whether you're joining us online or in the room this morning, we are starting our last mini-series in the book of First John. So as we've been kind of going through the book this summer of First John, we started out with a series called Spark, where we talked about how God is light, and because God is light, that means where we can kind of show the truth, or if you will, send a spark in the right direction, we can create change, we can bring that light into our life and into the life of those around us. And then the past 4 weeks, we did a series called Around the Campfire, where we talked about how God is love. And if God is love, that means his presence is like that invitation of a warm campfire, where you can feel safe, you can feel loved, which is all about God's presence as a God of love. But that also means there's people around the campfire with us that we have to treat a certain way. We have to show love and respect to those others, whether it's in our family or our neighbors, our community, believers and non-believers, because God loved us first. And so this morning we're going to start that final mini-series that I'm calling BLAZES. And I don't mean blazes like fire. I actually mean blazes as in trail blazes. So if you've done much hiking, maybe you've seen some of these trail blazes before, just markers on a trail to show you which way to go. And there's different kinds of trailblazers. A lot of them are typically paint to tell you where the trail starts, where it ends. If you need to keep going straight, make a left turn, make a right turn, where it intersects with another trail. In fact, if you're in a more complicated trail network, they're going to use different colors to help you know what trail you're on and where you're at. Sometimes they'll just use signs where they'll tell you the name of the trail, the direction you need to follow, and even the mileage you've got left on that trail. So if you get a little tired, you can kind of gauge, not going to add another 2 miles to this hike. No thanks, we'll head back to the parking lot now. And while we were in Maine, Jenna and I, we'd see some of these telling us where to go, if we're on the right path or not, to make sure, okay, yes, this is actually the trail, we're going the right way, and help us know when to get off the trail, when to stay on the trail, when we were connecting to a new trail, so we knew which way to go. And so as we've been talking about God is light and God is love, now we move to that fifth and final chapter in 1 John, where we're actually going to talk about God as life. So it's a little bit weird that the way John's going to mostly talk about God as life is by talking to us about obedience. We often would think of it that way, but John does. So we read this passage together just a few minutes ago. And so as we kind of revisit it, take a closer look at it, here's a question I want you to all ask yourself. The question is, why do you follow Jesus? Why do you follow Jesus? What's your reason for following Jesus? So as you think about that question and kind of just keep that in the front of your mind, let me reread just the first couple of verses of chapter 5 for us, where John writes, "Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands." So here's the thing. In most of 1 John, these first 4 chapters we've been talking about, John has actually said that verse backwards many times. Instead of saying, this is how we know we love the children of God, he's been saying, this is how we know you love God. You prove you love God by loving one another. But now John actually flips the script, and he says, now let's just not talk about how you prove that you love God. Let's talk about how you prove you love others. So he's going to be talking to us about that particularly and how we obey God. So here's where I think John is getting this from. If you'll remember, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has this encounter with some religious teachers called the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees, they don't care about following Jesus. They're not really interested in obeying him and what he has to say. They don't really want to learn anything from him. But they do want to try to trap him in his words and trick him and get him in trouble. They really want Jesus to say the wrong thing at the wrong time to the wrong people. And so in one of these accounts, as Matthew is telling his time with Jesus, kind of retracing those steps, He tells about a time where the Pharisees asked Jesus the question, "Hey Jesus, what's the most important commandment?" Thinking surely they're going to mess him up because Moses gave us 10 commandments and we have all these rules and all these laws we're supposed to follow. They're probably thinking there's no way Jesus is going to be able to sum this all up in one rule. He's going to have to pick something and he's going to lower the importance of something else and we'll get him. We'll get him in trouble. But Jesus knows how to answer this question really well, and so he says, well, here's the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the second is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire Old Testament leads to these two commands. And so they ask for one command, Jesus gives two commands. And so in our mind, we start to think, well, maybe one's a little more important than the other, or they're two separate things. But John would have been there that day. He would have heard that teaching. And I think over the years of serving Jesus and serving the church, I think he began to realize these two commands are more connected than maybe he thought at first. Because these two commands are actually two sides of the exact same coin. You can't have one without the other. You can't love God if you can't love your neighbor, and you can't love your neighbor if you can't love God. And in fact, here's a little spiritual health checkup for you. If you find yourself struggling to love God, it probably also means you're having a hard time loving your neighbor. And if you're having a hard time with your neighbor, you're probably going to find your relationship with God starts to feel a little strained and distant. If you have a hard time forgiving somebody, for instance, you're going to start to find something in your relationship with God will just feel off to you, because these two relationships go hand in hand. So in chapter 5, John flips that coin around and he says, okay, we've talked about loving others. Now let's talk about loving God. If you want to prove that you really love other people, you've got to love God. Which takes us back to that question. So why do you follow Jesus? What was it for you? Because this is how John is starting the trail, if you will. He's saying, okay, that trail marker that says where the trails start is love, which is how we ended with chapter 4 last week. We love because he first loved us. So the motivation, the reason we should obey God then, the reason we should follow Jesus is because of love. It should be out of love. If you've probably found if you obey for any other reason, obedience eventually just gets frustrating, exhausting, tiring, and it can even just make you downright angry. So John says where this all starts is love. And if we start with love, where he's wrapped up in chapter 4, it's actually going to get us to life. So here's how John starts marking out that trail for us. Verse 3, he says this, in fact, this is love for God. So like John, he loves to give us definitions. He says this is love for God, to keep his commands, and his commands are not burdensome. Now that word burdensome might be a little troubling for some of you, because that's not been your experience of following God. You would say, no. Following God it's really hard. Like, it requires a lot. When you think of obeying God and keeping his commands, the image that comes to mind is not a fun, hike with your friends going along a trail. It's the image of having this really heavy backpack that's weighed down, and it hurts, and it slows you down, and it tires you out, and it hurts your back. Maybe you've had, a bad church experience at one point where you would come to church and you would leave church feeling worse than when you got there. You just kept hearing about how bad you are, how terrible of a person you are, how messed up you are, how bad you should feel about your sin, and you just left feeling really guilty and beaten up. But John says, no, if you follow God, actually, his commands, if you obey him, you won't get beaten up. You won't feel weighed down. You won't feel burdened. You'll actually feel the complete opposite. Instead, obeying God actually leads to freedom and life, which is a little bit different than we might think or what we've experienced. So let me take you back to some other words that Jesus said. Some of you will remember this. Jesus once said, Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And what Jesus meant there is back in Jesus' day, a yoke was just it's a harness. It was a farming tool. You would hook up your team of oxen to it, and they could pull your plow through the fields at harvest time or carry around a cart, whatever it was. And in Jesus' day, the metaphor of a yoke was the instructions a teacher would give you. So your rabbi in the synagogue, or maybe a master that you were an apprentice under learning a job skill, they would give you their yoke, which is their set of teachings, their instructions, their commands. And Jesus is actually kind of sliding the Pharisees here, because here's what the Pharisees did, is they took the 10 commandments in the Old Testament and they began to interpret each and every commandment and created a book of about 600 other commands and rules you had to follow. So God just said, honor the Sabbath. That's all he said. The Pharisees decided, well, this is what counts as Sabbath. So if you walk more than so many steps, you broke Sabbath. If you help get your donkey who's fallen into a hole, you get him out, you broke the Sabbath. If you carry this much, you can cook this kind of food, but not this kind of food. You can carry this much weight, not that much weight. You can say this many words, not that many words. And Jesus is basically saying, my teaching's really easy. Love God, love your neighbor. That's it. That's it. There's not all these little boxes to check. There's not all these other little side rules. And John, I think, is reflecting on that and realizing, man, following God leads to freedom. It leads to life. It's actually so much easier than we tend to make it. So those same words I think John's reflecting on. He's like, all right, if we follow Jesus, if we obey his commands, the burden will be easy and light. We'll actually find rest instead of being weighed down. Because sometimes I think we feel like with obeying God, we feel like we're hamsters in a hamster wheel, or we're just on a treadmill that, some instructor will never turn off, and you just run and you run and you run, and you get tired and beaten down and exhausted, and you feel like you're not going anywhere. Well, that's probably because you started the trail all wrong. You didn't actually start with love. You maybe started with something else. So let's think about obedience this way. Think about it when maybe you've tried to start a new habit. So for example, with school just starting, maybe some of you have had to start getting up a little earlier in the morning. During the summer, you kind of slept in, you took it easy, now you got to adjust a little bit. I remember back in college when I had to do this. So back in my day, I can barely say that now. Back in my day, my college used to have 7 a.m. classes. And as a freshman, I listened to an upperclassman, and I decided to sign up for 7 a.m. Greek class. So I would, and literally my college, it doesn't get any better than this. My college was built on a hill. So I literally walked uphill both ways in the snow and ice of southern Missouri at 7 a.m. before the sun got up to take Greek class. And that was really difficult. So in order to get used to waking up, I had to change my routine. I couldn't stay up till like midnight or 1 a.m. hanging out with the guys in the dorm, because I had to get to bed early so I could wake up in time to go to my 7 a.m. class. I'm not a coffee drinker. I've tried. Many people have tried to save me and get me on coffee. Hasn't worked much yet. So I'd get up in the morning, I'd go to the bathroom, I'd splash cold water in my face. In the spring and early fall when the sun was at least up, I would just get outside and stare at the sun for a little bit to help me wake up. I'd jog some laps, do a few push-ups real quick to try to get me awake. I'd play loud rock music, whatever it took to help get me going. Now, first couple weeks of the semester was always so difficult. I'd be tired, I'd be exhausted, I'd be dozing off in class. We're going through verb endings, reciting vocabulary, and I'm like dozing off. But over time, sticking with it, it got a little easier. And it got a little easier, and it got a little easier. Until, now it's really hard for me to sleep in past like 7:30. It's just like ingrained into me. I feel like I'm supposed to be in Kenny Bull's Greek class right now. What's going on? And that's the same way obedience works, especially with God. At first, it's a little tough. It can be hard because we have our sinful nature. We have things about us we don't want to change, but we're convicted by the Holy Spirit. We realize we need to change. And so we start to partner with the Holy Spirit, and we realize we have to change some things in our life. And the good news is the Holy Spirit is with us to help that change and actually change us from the inside out. So at first, it's really hard. Like, you have to get accountability, you have to confess sin, you have to change your routines and your plans and the way you think and the way you talk and the way you live. But if you stick with it and you keep up with it, it starts to get a little easier. And slowly, the Holy Spirit actually changes who you are. And those temptations that at first were really difficult, they start to get just a little easier. And they're just not as interesting to you anymore. The Holy Spirit begins to change your heart and your soul and your desires and make you look a little more like Jesus. And that can take a really long time. But that's not burdensome. That leads to life. That leads to freedom. That leads you to becoming the exact kind of person God always knew you could be. It just takes time. But you've got to go back to that question. Why do you follow God? Why do you do it? Because that makes all the difference. Maybe you follow God because mom and dad tell you you're going to follow God. You're going to come to church every day. You're going to go to youth group. You're going to do this. You're going to do that. In our house, you're going to go to church. That's the way it's going to be. And you're like, all right, whatever. And here you are 30 years later, and you never really made your faith your own. And if you're honest, you're still here because mom and dad told you you're supposed to be here. And that's why you follow Jesus. Maybe you follow Jesus because you only really care about punching your ticket to heaven, and you just show up every week to keep your ticket punched. And that's about it. That's all it is. You're just kind of running on a treadmill with no end, just hoping, okay, I'm just going to make sure I get to heaven. Maybe you've just been so filled with guilt and shame that you come to church every week hoping to deal with it, but you actually believe more in your guilt than God's forgiveness. And so you still leave church feeling pretty bad, feeling like you're not feeling any better, feeling like you're still a terrible person, and you just can't, there's just that thing you did, and you just can't quite get over it. I'm not sure how you would answer that question of why you follow Jesus. And this week, I want you to think about that question. Maybe it may take a few hours of you sitting by yourself, journaling, thinking about that question. It might take a few days. But you should figure out why it is you follow Jesus. Because here's why that matters. Why you obey God will determine the direction of your life. Because if you're just following God because you just want him to bless you, or just because somebody else told you to, or just, to get something out of it, you're going to be really frustrated and angry. Because guess what? God's not always going to give you everything you want. There are going to be times where he's going to challenge you, where he's going to push you, and you're not going to want any part of it. He's going to convict you of sin, and you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's not what I signed up for. Or you're going to have to make your faith your own. At some point, you can't just have your parents' faith. You're going to have your faith. You're going to decide what you believe. And John's answer to that is, well, love God because he loved you first. It all flows out of love. If your obedience comes from love, it's not so frustrating. It's not so difficult. You're willing to do it. It just makes sense because it comes from a place of love. So here's the good news, though. The good news is, even if you started following God for the wrong reasons, or if you've got a bad answer to that, the grace part is Jesus will actually get you on the right track. Even if you started in the wrong place, he'll get you to the right place. He can do that. Even if you've been following Jesus for 40, 50 years and you realize, I haven't been really doing this out of love. I've been doing this out of something else. God can get you on the right track. Because obedience will determine the kind of person you become. I remember one time I had a friend in college he was a former guy in the Army. And one time in class, one of my professors asked him, hey, when you guys were in training and everything, don't the drill sergeants, they make you make your bed to a very specific quality, right? He's like, oh yeah, drill sergeants would see if they could bounce a quarter off of your bed to see if the sheets were tight enough. And he asked him, well, why do they do that? And he said, well, because if the guy next to you can't get up and make his bed the right way and follow those instructions and do that right, what makes you think they're going to listen to your captain or they're going to follow the plan, or they're going to keep their gun clean for combat, or they're going to have your back when things get tough. It might just be making a bed, but it means a whole lot more than making a bed. Because obedience to God is showing, are you willing to submit to the kind of person that he wants to make you into? Now, don't raise your hand for this part, all right? Don't raise your hand for this. Don't kind of side-eye your parents. But how many of you in here have a rule at home that you just don't like? Like you just, you're just like, man, mom and dad don't know what it's like to be my age in 2021. They don't get it. They don't understand me. They just don't. This rule is dumb. I don't know why I have to do this. Maybe it's a curfew. Maybe it's something around technology. Maybe it's about where you can go, where you can't go, what you have to do, what you can't do. Let me give you one of my rules growing up. So way back in the day of dial-up internet, all right? Some of you do not know what that is. That's fine. We'll tell you later. So dial-up internet, my dad bought our very first computer. It was a compact computer, I think. It was this ugly beige color. It was giant. It was heavy, you know. He set it up. We got dial-up internet, and I could finally play computer games. This was a whole new world to me. But my dad and my mom, they had a rule. You could only play on the computer for 1 hour on Saturdays. That's it. And I did not like that rule too much. I mean, every Saturday morning, I was excited. I'd run to the computer. I'd get on. I'd make the most of my time for that hour. You know, I'd remember all the things I wanted to do with that hour on the internet. But then, of course, my dad would come to the office and let me know when it was time to get off. And I would throw a fit. I would fight with him. I know it's hard for you to believe, but back then, oh yeah, I would fight. I would yell. I'd throw a fit. When him and my mom were preoccupied, I'd try to sneak to the office and get a little more time on the computer. I would try to wake up on Saturday before them and play a little more and then get off the computer and then, you know, get my hour. I tried everything to get around it. But as I got older, and when you get older, you'll probably realize this too, at some point, you realize what your parents were trying to do with all the rules they gave you. And even if you still don't agree and think, well, I would have done it differently, I'll do it differently with my kids, that's great, you can do that. But you'll probably get some respect for your parents because you'll realize, oh, they were trying to teach me something. They were trying to protect me from something because they love me. Same thing. My parents were trying to teach me respect because I had chores that I was supposed to do on Saturday, and I wasn't supposed to be on the computer all day because those chores need to get done. And they were teaching me there's so many more things to do than play on the computer, which is really helpful because of just how much technology has exploded. That taught me a lot. That's a good lesson. That's stuck with me. So here's the deal. Obeying God is a lot like that. He wants to turn you into someone. He wants to make you look more like Jesus. But if you're going to do that, you've got to be willing to submit to his commands. You've got to be willing to obey him. And not out of some sense of guilt, not because somebody else tells you to, but because you love him and you trust him. And just like how your parents gave you rules, he's got some rules to help make you the kind of person he knows you can be. And those are actually going to make you better. They're actually good for you, not bad for you. So let's think of it this way. So maybe this week, or the past couple of weeks, you've been to Walmart and had a very nice greeter kindly inform you that you should probably wear a mask when you walked in. It's not a requirement, it's a recommendation. I was a little shocked by this because I totally missed the CDC update thing. So a couple Saturdays ago, I was going to run into Walmart real quick and grab something, and I walk in and notice there's a box full of masks and a person telling people, hey, you don't have to, but you should. I was like, that's a shock to me. But I bet that Walmart greeter right now probably has the hardest job in the world because I just wonder how many times they've been chewed out, they've been yelled at, they've been screamed at, they've said, hey, good morning, welcome to Walmart. Would you please wear a mask? And then someone just yells and just chews them up one side and down the other. And they're just like, why am I doing this? What's going on? And if you noticed on our church sign, on one side, we put up a just be kind, if you've ever seen that sign. Yeah, I would say, the world needs a lot of kindness. The world also needs a lot of love, especially probably that Walmart greeter. Because whatever you think about masks, that poor person probably getting chewed up. Because here's the difference here. Here's where this all makes a huge difference between us and everywhere else. Is John finishes up in verse 4 and 5, and he talks about we have victory. We've overcome the world. And here's where that 7 a.m. Greek class was really helpful, because I learned in 7 a.m. Greek that there's a certain kind of verb tense that means an ongoing action. And that's the kind of verb tense that John uses for victory. So what he means is, every single time you choose to obey God, you are actually living in victory. The victory of Jesus defeating sin on the cross and raising from the dead and ascending into heaven and having all authority given to him. Every time you love God and you love your neighbor, you are showing to the rest of the world, we won. Because here's what the world does. Right now, the world lesson in obedience is, hey, if you don't like somebody for any reason, yell at them, name call them, belittle them, get furious at them, call them terrible names, hate them. That's the lesson. If you want to obey the world, go for it. Go ahead. I don't think it's going to do you a whole lot of good, though. But John says, if you start your obedience with God out of a place of love, because he loved us first, and every time you love God by loving his children, and you love his children to prove how much you love God, you are living out of a place of victory. It's kind of a little silent way you can kind of snub the world and be like, we won. Jesus has got this. He's my king. So yeah, I can be nice to the Walmart greeter. Yeah, I can treat you really well. I can love and serve my neighbor. That's what John's trying to tell us. So if you remember last week, I challenged all of us to think of that one person that, we've had a hard time getting along with or forgiving or whatever it is. And I've said, hey, serve them, love them, even if you've got to grit your teeth and force a smile. Well, don't worry. If you didn't get a chance to do that last week, you still get a chance to do it this week. Because when you love them, you're proving that you love God. And when you love God, you're proving that you love them. And I think that will help connect the two dots, the two sides of that coin. When you love your neighbor, you're loving God. When you love God, you'll love your neighbor. Because John's whole point is every single time we do that, we get to live in victory. We're showing the world Jesus really did win. My faith really does make a difference. We show that I'm not just following Jesus because somebody told me to or somebody makes me or because I'm just trying to, keep a certain image up. No, you get to say, I'm following Jesus because he loved me. I get to follow Jesus because he saw this goofy little high school kid and loved him so much more than he understood and said, would you follow me? He got this goofy high school kid to a week of CIY one summer and said, hey, would you follow me? And then over the years, he said, hey, I made you to get up in front of people and talk. Can you do that? Like, no, I'm really bad at public speaking. My speech class in high school is a disaster. He said, I know. Don't worry. We can work with that. We've done it before. And one step at a time, here I am. And so what's your reason for following Jesus? Because if your reason is out of love, there's no limit to where God will take you. Because John knows he'll make us look a lot like Jesus. And the world needs kindness, but the world really also needs Jesus. So as we continue in worship this morning, some of you in this room or watching online, you've never experienced the victory that Jesus gives. You've never done what John says in verse 5, where he says, who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. And you need to put your trust and your faith in him and him alone.